Everyone to this evening's Great Decisions. This is the second one that I've done this spring in this format. The first one was the one on China and it's over in Africa, and it's somewhat challenging to do a session like this without having the video, but I think we'll try to persevere through this process. A little bit about my own experience with the Persian Gulf. I've actually never served in the region until after I retired from the Foreign Service, when I was called back to for short assignments. I served in Iraq, in Erbil twice. I spent time in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia in the Yemen Affairs Unit. That was back in 2016. I was in Kuwait for the peace negotiations between the Houthis and the Gulf states. Those talks took place in 2016, and they eventually failed. But my first real introduction to the Persian Gulf in my career happened in the 1990s. I was in Washington in the Office of Energy at the State Department, and my portfolio was energy consuming countries, of course, the United States being the largest energy consuming country on the planet. We would have meetings of other like-minded energy consuming countries under the rubric of the International Energy Agency, headquartered in Paris. The International Energy Agency, the IEA, was responsible for such things as what to do in case of an emergency in the Persian Gulf, or an emergency anywhere in the world, which could then affect oil supply, which then affected, of course, oil prices. So the committee that I belonged to was called the SEQ, or Special Emergency Questions Committee. And when we met, and this is back 1998, 1999, 2000, the big issue at the time was what to do if there was an interdiction or a closure of the Persian Gulf. The Straits of Hormuz, as was described in the Great Decisions booklet, is very narrow. It's almost like a cork in the bottle, whereby if the Iranians wanted to, they could relatively easily close off the Persian Gulf and thus close off a huge portion of the world's oil supply. Now, this is 25 years ago. Today, I would venture to say that that committee probably is not quite as fixated on the Persian Gulf, particularly Western Europe and the United States, because we've kind of weaned ourselves down a little bit from our dependence on Persian Gulf oil. And in fact, the United States has become a net oil or energy exporter over the last few years. So whereby it's of great strategic importance for us to protect the sea lanes and the supply of oil globally. As far as the direct impact on the United States, it's a lot different today than it was just a couple decades ago. That was my exposure to security questions in the Persian Gulf. Now, the article in our Great Decisions magazine went through a bit of a history lesson as to how far back our interests in the Persian Gulf go, and goes into, of course, some of the other actors that are involved in the Gulf, certainly other oil-consuming countries, the Soviet Union, and then Russia, and other regional countries, Israel, the obviously the Iranians and the Saudis, who are the two heavyweights in the area. And I think a lot of what they talk about was, I think it's pretty familiar to most of us, any of us who've been, following news events, following events, trends over the last 20, 30 years. I think we're fairly familiar with a lot of the issues going on. We know, of course, about within Islam, the division between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, which is very well reflected in the two 900-pound gorillas of the region, Shia Iran and Sunni, very Wahhabi Sunni Saudi Arabia. We also are familiar with the other actors, the Iraqis, of course. We have a very intimate familiarity with what has happened in Iraq over the last 3 decades. Increasingly, the issue of refugees and the impact of conflict in Yemen, in particular, but certainly in some of the other countries in the region. I think also one area that probably was not as well emphasized in this particular article concerns the water deficit in the region, and the fact that it's pretty much an ecological disaster area in many parts of the Middle East around the Persian Gulf. We don't hear quite as much about this happening in the Gulf itself because the littoral countries have had the resources to do desalination, or they have not been dependent on water, groundwater perhaps as much as others. But this is an extraordinarily serious situation throughout the region. Climate change has had a dramatic impact. I know when I was stationed in Erbil and in Iraqi Kurdistan, July temperatures were routinely 114, 115, extraordinarily dry. And again, the impact of global warming has on agriculture and on living conditions and on things like energy demand for air conditioning. So all these factors, and I'm not getting into any details, all these factors, I believe, certainly have are a component. Each one of them is a component of the overall Persian Gulf security. I thought what I would do, Ann, is open this up, if I may, and have other people jump in, and then we can see what people think about the topic.
Sure. I would like to say one thing about that. Just unmute if you have something to say, please unmute yourself, and whoever wants to go first.
Larry, can I say something to you?
Absolutely.
If you can hear me. I want to throw you a curveball in the beginning. I've been to the Middle East many times myself from 1983. I got into Dubai, never been to Kuwait, got into Abu Dhabi. In 2017, I spent a couple weeks in Saudi Arabia with a New York Times outfit, which was the first time they were even permitted to go there. And I got into Qatar, or as you guys would pronounce it, Qatar, which was kind of interesting because at that time, they were being opposed by a lot of countries, including Egypt. And the people I've talked to who were Egyptian, they didn't know their status as most people who do work in the Middle East. The Filipinos, the Palestinians, the Indians, they work there as basically indentured servants, and they work for usually a 2-year program. They hold their passport. They even have different legal trials and legal systems for them. I mean, it is really extraordinarily brutal, and it's been criticized so often. And I'm not even talking about the Khashoggi issue here either. And who knows what Biden is going to do. I guess privately they have their own opinions. But this fellow, I think it was on page 29 of the book, I've noticed this, and I read about this guy before, Martin Indyk.
Correct.
Who used to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. I mean, he's such a fascinating guy.
Yes.
That he really feels that the Middle East is not even is simply not even worth it anymore because we don't even have any vital interest there. You even noted about the amount of money. I mean, about the we are a net exporter of oil. We have shale oil, natural gas now. So we do what vital interest do we have there? When the British left the Middle East in the 70s and we kind of replaced them, that started a lot of problems. And of course, in 79, you have Nixon and Kissinger and the Shah, which caused that Iranian counter-revolution. And the irony is that what I've read and I've experienced is that Israel has some weird foreign relationships with Saudi when they're opposed to Iran. And I think just recently, Saudi permitted Israel to use their airspace and go across there, which they haven't since, I guess, 1948 or whatever.
Mhm.
I mean, there's a lot of changes going on. I mean, it's just so fascinating what's happening. But I guess what Indyk said, and you being a diplomat, he was quoted in another source saying that diplomats are sent abroad to lie for their country. Now, Talleyrand and those guys in the early 19th century would say that, but they would say it with a little more sophistication. So just comment on some of that, because is the Middle East really vital to us anymore?
Well, Andy, there's a lot there to unpack. I mean, a lot. First off, when you described what you observed in the Persian Gulf with the treatment of the expats, whether they be Filipino, Indian, Sri Lankan, whatever, this, I mean, in many ways, it's kind of like apartheid behavior. And it wasn't a question of being treated as second-class citizens. They weren't citizens at all, and they had basically no rights whatsoever. I would say, though, that if this had been in other parts of the world, perhaps we might have taken it up as more of a human rights issue. But given that this is, again, the Arab world, the Persian Gulf, and our vital interests over for decades over oil, we tended not to get engaged in those practices. Martin Indyk, by the way, was ambassador to Israel twice. Very rare for anybody to actually become an ambassador twice to the same country. He was also, I believe, he might have been assistant secretary for a short while. He was. This is during the Clinton years when he was ambassador. He does have a point, but there's always this sense of what I would call sunk costs, and there's no region of the planet where the United States has more sunk costs than the Middle East.
Where he needs a link.
Yeah, and sunk cost means basically what have we already put into the damn place? And if you add up everything that we pretty much, and I shouldn't use the term invested, but everything that we've actually of our wealth that we've actually placed in these places, whether it be with the Iraq wars or the sanctions with Iran or support for Saudi Arabia, an incredible amount of sunk costs that we find difficult to walk away from as a nation and as a global leader. So if we were to admit that there's nothing we can do, walk away, that also, on top of all of what we've expended, indicates that as a global power, we're abrogating the field. We're saying enough. We've had it, and that could then have basically a ripple effect with U.S. power globally. Now, to that statement that you quoted by Ambassador Indyk, which, by the way, I don't think is an Indyk statement. I mean, you're right. I think that could go back all the way to Talleyrand, that, how diplomats, are paid to lie for their country. I would put a corollary to that. And I would say this, that, and I use this specifically for consular officers, people who are doing visas. You know, when you had to say no a lot, people who you were denying a visa to. But I was told on my first assignment in Mexico by my boss that the secret to a good officer, a good consular officer, was to be able to tell somebody no and have them walk away with a smile. And I think that in being a good diplomat, if you could basically do the same thing or tell somebody to go to hell and have them look forward to the trip, that is the secret to being a great diplomat. And we do have a few of those. Unfortunately, we have a lot fewer now than we did before because many of them have been squeezed out of the State Department. And I would argue that there is a severe shortage of high-level talent right now, people who have 30, 35 years, diplomatic experience. Too many of those people have left the Foreign Service in the last 3 or 4 years. So it gets back to that other issue that you kind of raised there about diplomacy. But if I don't have an answer to the larger question that you raised as to our strategic interests in remaining in the Persian Gulf. I would probably come down on the side of yes, we should remain. We have to remain. The risk globally of a nasty war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, for example, or between Israel and Iran, it's just too great. We definitely fumbled in Iraq. I would also say we fumbled in Afghanistan, but it doesn't mean that now we should just take our ball and go home and then expect that everything's going to turn out peachy keen. So whether we like it or not, I would say yes, we're kind of stuck, and the real issue now is how do we what level of engagement and investment do we make? Does that help you at all, David? Give you any insight as to you're on mute though? Oh, Andy, I'm sorry. Yeah, you're on mute. You're still You're still on mute.
Yeah, I think you gave an excellent response.
Well, you made it a very challenging question or series of questions, but anyway, I prefer not to get into the weeds of kind of if we do this, then this happens or whatever. I think we have to look at it as a kind of holistically, the whole region holistically, and not try to kind of say, look at Saudi Arabia, U.S.-Saudi relations, or U.S. Gulf, Kuwait relations. I think we really have to look at the whole thing kind of as a whole. And unfortunately, the Saudi behavior, particularly since 2017, and especially with the murder of Khashoggi, it's extraordinarily distressing because we're kind of stuck with the Saudis. Not, I don't know how you get out from under it. I'm sure if there was a way, the Biden administration would love to know about it.
Well, an interesting private comment. When I was in Saudi for a couple of weeks with the New York Times outfit, one of the English language newspapers they had there was complaining about people, the Saudis who aren't real, they're not permitted, I guess, to be manual laborers because they have all the foreigners doing it, but they were given at least a month or longer for vacation, and they get free energy and free air conditioning. And one of the biggest complaints was that they would leave their air conditioning on in their homes and apartments for that one whole month. Yeah. And they're trying to say, you can't do that. Now, I know it sounds like a silly thing, but
no, it's
the
not.
energy was so abundant, and they're trying to make these cutbacks and trying to figure out what to do.
I will say this, Andy. When I was in Saudi Arabia, what impressed me the most was that they have the potential to be the world's largest energy producer just with solar. When you go through that country and you get sun 365 days a year, and we're not talking about, low in the horizon sun, they get real sun. You think, oh my God, they could be producing, gigawatts of electricity simply through solar, and then using storage systems, or going into their, using your hydrocarbons at night. But incredible solar potential, incredible. And I saw very little of it, although I understand that the Saudis do have a mission to build it up. But I think that all of these oil producing nations in the Persian Gulf have a tremendous opportunity by going to solar. Same thing in Iraq. I just was floored by the fact that they had so much potential in Iraq for solar. Here's another thing that blew me away. Yemen. Now, Yemen does not have oil. They are a very densely populated country, dirt poor compared to their neighbors. They've been at war now for 6 years, essentially, with the Saudis. They've had their own civil war for as long as anybody can remember. And when I was in the Yemen Affairs Unit in 2016, the way I communicated, and believe it or not, the embassy had relocated to Jeddah. The U.S. embassy was in Jeddah, but we still had staff in Sana'a in Yemen, even though it was basically, under siege. And the way I communicated with them was WhatsApp. And there was no electricity grid. There was no electricity system. So how are they able to receive a computer, link from me via WhatsApp? And the answer was they were using solar. Okay. On their roof, they would get a solar panel that probably was no bigger than this, that they paid the equivalent of maybe 100 or 150 bucks, Chinese made. And that one solar panel is what they used for their computer. And then when they weren't running a computer, they probably were putting a refrigerator or lights or whatever. I mean, talk about micro solar. The houses of Sana'a putting a solar panel because that's the only source of electricity they have. That, I mean, if that doesn't tell you the future, the 21st century, the direction we need to go in the 21st century, I don't think anything will. And this, to my mind, the ecological disaster of the Middle East is probably more dangerous than the political disaster or the religious disaster, because ecologically, the place is going downhill very, very fast. In Erbil, when I was, they basically were drawing all their water from groundwater sources. And I don't know if it was artesian, I'm not exactly sure, but it's the Middle East. So groundwater is not being recharged very quickly. And yet you would see, even on the compound at the consulate, when they would wash these cars with hoses every day, every morning, the staff would be washing the consulate vehicles just with a hose like this, and then they throw the hose down while they wipe the vehicle down. And meanwhile, when I speak to the authorities, in the water authorities in Erbil, they would tell me how quickly the groundwater is being depleted. So, I mean, the evidence is there. The behavior is not conducive to resolving these ecological problems. Water is the #1 issue in Saudi Arabia. I think water is much more expensive than oil. And these are challenges that we in the West and in the United States, we're not really thinking about. So you read this and you think that that what's going on here is mostly political, and it largely is. But in my view, the real 21st century challenge in the Persian Gulf is ecological, and it's they have to shift, and they have to shift very swiftly, or else the place is going to become a dead zone. I may sound a bit dire, but again, that's just kind of how I reacted to seeing the place. And I was there in 2013 to 2016, on and off. So it relatively recently. If anybody else has any comments?
Anybody else
or
have comments?
questions?
Tom, do you want to say anything?
You have to unmute yourself.
Everybody's very quiet tonight.
Well, when you're muted, you forget to.
This is true.
Sorry, I don't know what happened. I couldn't get in. I just got in. So I'm not sure what the discussion has been at this point. So let me just sit back for a couple minutes.
Okay, sure.
Now,
Fred?
yeah,
Fred, do you want to say anything?
Yeah, I'd like to ask Larry to go back to Khashoggi, and it just seems like such a dilemma. We can't really do much to irritate the Saudis, but it seems pretty clear that the crown prince there has dirty hands in this whole affair, and it was a terrible murder what they did to him. And it's an outrage, crying for justice. How's Biden? And I think Biden said he was going to approach that with some discipline. But how the heck can he possibly diplomatically handle that kind of a situation?
well, unfortunately, it's been 28 months since the murder. And we've known for 28 months who committed the murder, okay, under whose orders. So when you have that kind of lag time and you've had a change of administration, it becomes, the whole thing becomes so difficult that had this happened, had the Trump administration after the murder imposed sanctions or made statements even against the murder, it would have had a much more dramatic impact than if obviously President Biden announces some sanctions. So when these events take place, you really have to strike while the iron's hot, or else it just you lose your leverage and your more importantly your moral authority. The United States has no moral authority in this instance because it shows that, well, what would happen if if there were a return to a like-minded administration in 2024, they probably, we could flip right back. So there's that. But I would say that if we were to memorialize Khashoggi, by far the best solution to this would be to leverage his murder into reforms in Saudi Arabia. That is, if you could use this somehow to force, maybe that's the wrong, coerce the Saudis to liberalize a bit more, then his death will not have been in vain. But I mean, that's a pretty tall order, and one where, again, if we had the moral persuasive authority with the Europeans and with other like-minded countries, we could perhaps leverage something out of this. At this point, the Biden administration, unfortunately, is between a rock and a hard place. Now, they have talked about imposing some sanctions against travel, by senior leaders and people who've been implicated. I'm sure MBS will not be making any visits to the United States. I can assure you that the United States will not be making any high-level visits to Saudi Arabia. The weapons sales probably are completely under review, et cetera. But it is at this point in time, I don't see much more than the Biden administration can do. And let me add this: Tony Blinken. I don't remember ever meeting Tony Blinken. I actually worked for a short while under his father, who was had been at the end. I guess it would have been in the early '90s. Was ambassador to Hungary when I was stationed there, 1994. So I actually worked under his father, and I remember at the time, his son Tony Blinken was an intern, I believe, at the White House. so times he certainly come come full circle. But these are the people that the administration is planning to put in charge, and it takes a long time for them to get confirmed. But people like Wendy Sherman, I mean, this is the top talent that is available right now to the State Department. I would hope that they'd be able to pull other people back who've already left. One being, for example, Reading High School's own Stephen Mull, who, of course, we honored, 3 or 4 years ago. So, if the talent can be brought back, there may be some hope, but it's tough, to reverse the institutional, the morale, kind of the morale rot that had taken place, and now you have to kind of re-energize a lot of these very fundamental policy things, issues such as what do you do with the Saudis? It's tough. I don't envy for 1 minute the decision making that's going on in the West Wing right now.
Can I ask you a question about MBS? Somewhere I read that he is the 7th crown prince that his father has named as a crown prince. That the father, the king of Saudi Arabia, gets to appoint
Salman, yeah.
or anoint crown princes. Can he, if the United States were to put enough pressure, would he be able to unanoint him as crown prince?
I don't see that possibly happening, given what I know. See, Saudi Arabia, if I can go back and do a little history, the original king was Saud, Ibn Saud.
Right.
And this back in the 20s, he you had, of course, after World War I, you had Faisal, and you had the family that had the Hashemite line family that had helped the British, and the British wanted to, were offering parts of the Middle East to them. But within Saudi Arabia, they lost in a power struggle with the Saud family, who were much more very strict Wahhabi Muslims, took charge of Saudi Arabia from the 1920s, and Ibn Saud ruled that country, under his own hand for the next 30 years or so. After his death, the monarchy then would pass to his sons, of which he had many sons. But of course, those sons, that generation, is aged out, so to speak. So his youngest son would have been born, I guess sometime in the 40s. So as these sons age out, the monarchy will then be shifted to the next generation. And the big issue in Saudi Arabia over the last, probably 50 years has been what is going to be the line of reign in the Saud dynasty. So you've had all these sons with all these children, and all these children having children, And now if you add them all up, I don't know how many, but the family now is like 5,000 princes, which again, it suffocates Saudi Arabia, because all of these princes are basically parasites, for lack of a better word, on the Saudi economy and on the Saudi system. Now, it's kind of, I don't know I should, but I do not know the exact details of what's going to happen when Salman dies. And at this point, it would pass to the next, the reign would pass to the next generation of his son. I don't know what these other princes are thinking. I do suspect that over the last few years, MBS has gone out of his way to neutralize those cousins who would be rivals to him. I don't have any answer to how this is all going to shake out. I'm sure there are people a lot smarter than me who still have no idea. But in all likelihood, MBS will become the next monarch, reigning monarch.
Yeah.
Right now, he's performing kind of as if he were a prime minister. And I don't see, I just don't know if there is any strong opposition to his eventually taking over the throne. I just don't know. But it's this whole line of reign of who gets to rule the monarchy has been a vexing question for the Saud family now, for I would say going all the way back to the original patriarch.
So even though MSB is not Crown Prince number one, Crown Prince number one doesn't automatically, or doesn't
I can't answer that question.
have a claim to the throne.
He certainly is the first among equals at this point.
Okay.
I think probably what we've seen with this generation, they've all been highly educated. Doesn't mean that they have wisdom, but they are educated, and they do speak unaccented English, and they do know how to kiss our butts. So, it is of absolutely no surprise that an authoritarian like MBS, and he is an authoritarian, would be so appealing to President Trump. Okay, now I would say that somebody a little more savvy, like President Biden, sees right through the act. But I don't know how much influence anybody outside of Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, has on what's going on at this level. And Andy could probably vouch for this. The level of control in that country is pretty impressive. It is a very authoritarian regime and control. I was there when I was there in Saudi Arabia. It was during Ramadan, and boy, do they have that place locked up, for Ramadan. And the prayers, and when prayer time comes around, everything has to stop. All business stops. You can't even go into a restaurant until prayer time is over, and certainly even more so during Ramadan. It is a theocracy that there's no other government on the planet, with probably the exception of North Korea, that is so overwhelmingly dominant over its population. Would you agree with that, Andy?
Yeah. Let me make a comment. In 1988, I spent some time in Bahrain, which of course is an island, and they have one of the United States naval fleets there. the bridge that was built there by the Dutch is one of the longest bridges in the world. And we all had a saying that the Saudis who don't drink, on weekends, they would come across the bridge and we call it the longest bridge to sin in the world because they could come over. And in Bahrain, you could drink in the hotels and other places. And they were very, very strict with a lot of things, but you could do that. A lot of them would crash their so-called Mercedes-Benz and they would come home. I mean, it was really remarkable. But interestingly, the Saudis who have their women veiled, the Saudi women veiled, not the non-Saudi women veiled in Saudi, they would love to come there because they were permitted at that time to take their veil off. And they had many more entertainment venues, which was really fascinating. But it just shows you the conflict and the differences.
Well, I would use a different word than that, Andy. I would add the word hypocrisy.
Hypocrisy, yeah. I didn't bring that word up. But back in 1953, the Mossadegh government in Iran was overthrown by the CIA, obviously, and to control things. And the Shah's family came back into the power. Then you have Nixon, you have Kissinger, who ended up kissing his butt. And of course, that propelled the Iranian revolutionary Khomeini to come in 79. But the fascinating thing about that is the more I'm reading is that it says that the situation in I have it here. Yeah, that the situation in Iran, that the hostages that were caught, they won that. They weren't really penalized for that. You know, there was an attempted penalty with all these things, but I remember meeting a Canadian guy when I was over there, and he'd laugh because he was working with the oil business. They were supposed to join the United States of the embargoes, and he was getting oil from Libya and transporting it there. Now, he might have been lying, but Libya, of course, was an active player in a lot of things. So there's ways to get things done.
Yeah.
But this
Yeah.
weapons of mass destruction that happened, which was really a canard, it was really terrible.
Yeah,
Because that
and
was
you
so
bring
phony.
you brought up Iran, and I guess we were kind of focusing too much on Saudi Arabia. We need to also speak about Iran. I will confess I've not been to Iran, but I have been as close to Iran as I am to my computer, because I went up to the border, literally to the border, when I was stationed in Herat, Afghanistan. So I've been to the border with Iran, and I've actually at an iftar dinner, a post-Ramadan dinner, I was actually seated next to the Iranian consul general in Herat. So I got close to the Iranians, but not that close. You are correct. We have a very complicated history with the Iranians, and it goes back even before Mossadegh. I mean, it goes back to World War II and even earlier than that, but particularly in the 50s, and our support for the Shah, the Iranian Revolution, which of course we were clearly the foil for that revolution. But it's funny, Iranians, I think, for the younger generation of Iranians, their feeling towards the United States has never really been one of deep anger. It's been one of deep disappointment. I think Iran has been ruled by a theocracy now since Ayatollah Khomeini it took over in 79. It's a theocracy. However, it's a theocracy that also its method of control is through these governmental security groups like the Quds Force and these kind of their militia. They're kind of the muscle behind the ruling hierarchy, the religious hierarchy. And then you have this kind of almost, I think, a shambolic parliament, but it's there. And had the United States been, I think, much more, come down hard after 1970, after 81, after the Hotchkiss crisis. But had we come around to kind of opening up with Iran in the 1980s and 90s, had we seriously catered to the young generation in Iran, I think history would have been a lot different. We have kind of had this bitterness towards Iran for over 40 years as a result of the hostage crisis. The hostage crisis really was not, it was not a groundswell issue. It was basically just a handful of these revolutionaries who got carried away, and all of a sudden they were holding a tiger by the tail, and they just never let go. But we as a nation have never let them forget that, and we have never forgiven them for that. And we have just constantly, for the last 4 decades, have been, kicking the Iranians every opportunity we can. And even when we try to let them off the floor, with, which I think President Obama was trying to do with the JCPOA, even when we try to let them up, then we have a change of administration, and the next administration comes in and punches them right back. So I think the Iranians have a very legitimate gripe about American policy over the last over almost half a century, over more than half a century, and we as a country should have been the more mature partner in all this, and we haven't really behaved that way. So we've always made Iran into the enemy, and they, to their discredit, they apparently have fed off this and have then created their own nastiness, whether it be Hezbollah or the Houthis, support for the Houthis in Yemen, or some of these other behaviors. But they've been extraordinarily kind of with us. They have been very very patient in waiting and waiting for us to change, and we've never really changed. And so I'd say the real issue with Iran is sheer disappointment with America. And again, I don't know what we can do now, except to try to soften our image a little bit. And they're going to have to come around too. And we're kind of at an impasse. And by the way, that's my dog barking his head off here.
It strikes me that you're being a little too kind to Iran, that Iran's antisocial behavior is not just directed against the United States. Iran, through its proxies, has been very disruptive and brutal throughout many countries in the Middle East, and they have behaved as a pariah in the world. For instance, when they bombed the Israeli embassy or a consulate in Argentina.
That's
I
right.
mean, states don't do that to other states. Terrorists do. Yet for Iran, there's not a sharp distinction between their terrorist arm and their official state arm. So I think it's a little too soft of you to say that if the US had been more open to Iran, that Iran would have become a better actor in the world.
You're absolutely right. And I shouldn't come off as being as sounding quote unquote soft. They have been a bad actor. But countries are bad actors all the time, and we can change, and they can change. They have committed a lot of terrorist behavior, including the bombings and attacks all over the world. But if you were to ask them, they would look upon this, they would say this is part of their defensive they're doing this in defense. Now, I don't think any of us would agree that terrorism is a good defense, but from their perspective, they probably, they feel that they've been cornered, and this is their way of lashing out. Now, we don't like it. We nearly went to war with them a number of times. Certainly in the 1980s, we almost went to war with them. We certainly could have come to blows even within the last year, and within the last few months, could have very easily have deteriorated into war. But I tend to feel that we have actually, unfortunately, enabled the more radical elements and the authoritarian elements in Iran, and have not been sensitive to the reformist elements that were kind of underneath. And as a result, authoritarianism, in my view, is the rule in Iran, and any hope of a kind of any kind of democratic, small d democratic change is been suffocated. Yeah, Iran is a complicated place. Certainly, their behaviors have not been that of a state actor. But there was a period of time, I'd say in the early 2000s, when we could have worked with the Iranians and had been very successful at it. When we went into Afghanistan, the Iranians actually were helpful to us. They opposed the Taliban as much as we did. And yet then we immediately turned around and create, call them part of this quote unquote axis of evil. And that just, again, punctured the balloon of any hope for trying to improve relations. So yeah, we have made a lot of mistakes in our relationship with Iran. I'll leave it at that.
Yet when the Iranian population had a popular uprising, they were brutally put down. They were slaughtered in the streets. So do you really think there's an opportunity to reform when you have a regime that will go to any lengths to maintain its position?
Well, in a lot of ways that you just described, a lot of regimes that we do support. The Saudis have been a little bit, I think, more careful, but they've also been fairly brutal, and certainly even before the murder of Khashoggi. But the United States is, from a strategic point of view, we have supported some pretty nasty actors out there. Now, I'm not going to grade it on a scale of 1 to 100 where the Iranians come down, but when it has been in our national interest, we've supported governments who have repressed their populations. And I'm not saying we should ever support the Iranians for repressing their people, but it doesn't mean that we completely turn our backs into what is happening. I mean, if the United States had been much more conciliatory at some point with the Iranian government, they might not have been so brutal with regards to their repression, because they might have not seen themselves as getting away with it. And we don't know. I mean, it was all supposition, but we have treated Iran in a kind of a special category of this nature of evil category. The only country that I can think of which came close was like Gaddafi's Libya. And look what, things have changed there. So yeah, I think a lot of it was kind of what we saw as our national interests. I think part of it, was the dynamic with Israel. Part of it was the oil importance of Iran. And the fact that, in the, even starting in the 1980s, when we were with the Iran-Iraq war, which was extraordinarily bloody, where we actually came down on the side of Saddam Hussein in that war. So I think we made some pretty significant strategic blunders over the years. That's, but again, the Iranians themselves have made some pretty bad blunders too.
Larry, it
Mhm.
seems to me that the Persian Gulf region that we're studying has absolutely such little institutional democratic values or anywhere. And when you, except for Israel, which has democracy, when you move over to Morocco, the entire swath of North Africa and all the Arab countries are very similar to a lesser degree. And look what happened in Egypt. But I can quote Kissinger as a diplomat who stated somewhere, and I wrote this down, that he said that the goal of diplomacy is not peace, it's stability and security.
That's an interesting quote. I'm not familiar with that particular quote, but I won't question Kissinger's credibility.
Not peace, but stability and security.
Yeah.
We just, I'm
that's
sorry,
valid.
we just have a couple minutes left and we have to wrap it up. So Larry,
I think, well, I mean, if anyone else has any observations that they'd like to make, I thought David's was very, has made some really excellent points here. And also we should note that when we talk about, the Persian Gulf or the Arabian Gulf, as the Arabs like to prefer to call it, this is a complicated region and these are complicated issues.
Yeah.
We're nothing simple, and there is no logic to what goes on in the Middle East. We can't put our own American frame, an American kind of way of looking at things and apply it to the Middle East. It just doesn't work. This is the outstanding example of how we're in a policy situation. We really don't know what to do next.
right. And I think that's a good note to end on. We don't know what to do next, and we don't know what the Arabian Gulf countries are going to do next either. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I want to thank you, Larry, for an excellent program again. Next week is Brexit. And if I find a video, I'll send it to you.
Good job, kid.
Yeah,
Thank you
Yeah,
all.
thanks, Ann.
Larry, thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome, everyone.
Thanks, Ann,
Stay
and
safe.
thanks, Larry.
Thank you.